All right, it's my great pleasure to present Jeff Pritchard, who will talk to us tonight about the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition and how we bought Alaska and how Alaska made us money and all that stuff. So, Jeff, please take it away.
Well, I thought since so many of this group is from California, it'd be fun, maybe even a little educational, to look at something a little further north, up here in Seattle, and certainly even further north, up in Alaska, where a lot of this is based. Um, and I first have to confess, there's probably a little more history to this than numismatics, but we will get there. What I thought we'd cover tonight is the actual purchase of Alaska. This was a pretty big piece of real estate, so it's kind of interesting how it happened. And then, of course, the discovery of gold, because that's the real underpinning of why the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition took place in 1909 in Seattle. And then look at the exposition, how it impacted Seattle in the Northwest, because it was a big deal for Seattle. And then we'll be looking at some of Mr. Hyder's so-called dollars and some of the other items that were created for the exposition. Well, the actual purchase of Alaska was consummated in 1867. And actually, the work on it proceeded almost for a decade. And the two gentlemen who were most involved in this, representing Tsar Alexander II, was the Baron Edward de Steckel. And de Steckel was kind of the Tsar's foreign minister since the mid 1850s. So he was very involved and knowledgeable about this whole Alaska situation for quite some time, because the actual seeds of selling Alaska to the United States began quite early. And then representing the US on our side of the table was Secretary of State William Seward. And he, of course, began in the Lincoln administration and then continued on under Andrew Johnson's administration when the sale actually took place. Seward was the real driving force. He had a real passion for the purchase of Alaska. Now, just to kind of go through a quick timeline, the actual seeds of Russia selling what was a colony for them was initiated in a letter from the Tsar's brother to him. This is the Duke of Constantine, where his brother suggested that the Tsar consider selling Alaska to the US. And I'll go through some of the reasons. When President Buchanan heard of this, he said, certainly we'll consider buying Alaska. But the Steckel realized that that was an election year, and it would really make sense to wait until the next administration, the US administration, came in. Of course, then we had the Civil War, and that sidelined everything during the war. Certainly we weren't going to pay a lot of gold for anything during that period of time. And after the war was over, at the end of 1866, the Tsar then reconfirmed he was interested. He really wanted to sell the Alaskan colony to the US. About 4 months later, after a lot of negotiation, the terms of the purchase were decided in the Treaty of Cessation. And then about a year later, Congress approved paying for it. The reason Congress took over a year to approve payment, a couple of reasons. One is this was really looked at as William Seward's initiative. And William Seward wasn't very popular with a lot of congressional members. And so they dragged their feet quite a while. The other element, of course, is in 1868, Congress was consumed with the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. It was a big deal. So the thing really got slowed down more so than normally might have been the case. So very quickly, why in the world did Russia want to sell a pretty big piece of real estate? Well, at the time, and we have to remember, this was kind of viewed as a barren wasteland. And the number one reason that drove the Tsar to decide to sell was they were convinced that sooner or later Great Britain would try and seize Alaska because of its proximity to Canada, because of the commercial power of the Hudson's Bay Company at the time. And they didn't have any fleet in what they called the American waters to defend the colony. And so the Tsar was worried that they would lose Alaska, not get anything for it, and it'd be a huge international humiliation. So decided to sell. As far as the United States, there's a lot of, I don't want to call them rationale, but um, this would frustrate Great Britain's Pacific ambitions. This would essentially, um, sandwich British Columbia between Alaska and what was then the Oregon Territory. And there was the manifest destiny issue. But the real reason that historians say that this happened is because William Seward wanted it to happen to burnish his credentials, to add to his legacy. He wanted to add this geography to the country. Well, after the negotiations, and this is a copy of the check that was issued for 7.2 million, which was payable in gold. And of course, in today's gold market, that's almost $1 billion. Um, the negotiation would make a great case study in business school because the Steckel totally outmaneuvered and out negotiated Seward. Seward was so anxious for this to happen that Steckel just read him like a book. The Tsar was hoping to get as much as $5 million and ended up getting 7.2. So, whereas in hindsight, obviously, this was a great deal for the United States, we paid a little more than we probably needed to. And of course, because of that, Seward was ridiculed in the media, in the political sphere, by the public for buying this what was viewed as an absolute wasteland. It was referred to as Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox. One newspaper that I came across referred to Seward having bought a sucked orange. Now, there's an interesting metaphor, pretty graphic. And so for 30 years, this was viewed as just a colossal waste of money until gold was discovered. And on August 16th, 1896, not too dissimilar than the gold discovery in California, on a small creek, a handful of locals discovered gold, lots of gold. And that just turned the whole Alaska thing upside down. It turned Seattle upside down. Once word got out in early '97 of this gold strike, the mayor of Seattle quit. Most of the police force, all the cable car drivers, because everybody realized, this is kind of a first come, first serve. Whoever got up there soonest had the best chance of finding gold. Just to quickly go over some numbers, they estimate about 100,000 people set out for the Klondike, the gold area, but only about 30 to 40,000 actually made it up there. Because as you'll see, it was really hard to get to. Of that group, only about 4,000 actually found any gold. And of that, only a couple hundred actually, quote, struck it rich. This kind of shows the route. And you can see down here at the bottom, everything funnels through Seattle, which was great for the merchants, because obviously in a gold rush, that's how you really make money. You sell stuff to the stampeders. But the route was this inland waterway route to Skagway or Dyea. In fact, you can actually go there by cruise ship now. And then about 35 miles over the Chilkoot Trail to the headwaters of the Yukon River. And from there, you would go down 500 miles down the Yukon River to Dawson City, the area where the gold rush was. But like I said, it was really tough going. The terrain was not conducive to pack animals, so most everything had to be carried manually. And of course, for half the year, you've got temperatures well below freezing. So it was just a real arduous journey, and why so many people set out for it and didn't end up getting there. Now, this is probably the most iconic picture and the most iconic part of the gold rush. And this is going up Chilkoot Pass, or it's called the Golden Stairs to get to the scales. And I've actually been there. It's only about 1,000 feet from this kind of the staging area down below to the top. But what made it so tough was the top of the pass was the border between Canada, or the Yukon Territory, and Alaska. And at the top of the pass, the Canadian Mounted Police were requiring prospectors to have a year's supply of food with them. Now, this was before freeze-dried or dehydrated food. So a year's supply of food weighed about 1,200 pounds. And if you add in equipment, gear, tools, and whatnot, you're talking about 2,000 pounds. And the stampeders had to lug this stuff up, start doing the math. And if you can only carry about 100 pounds up the pass at a time, and as this one historian notes, it could take 6 hours for one round trip at the height of the gold rush. You're ferrying a lot of stuff over a lot of days to get up to the border to carry this 2,000 pounds of gear that was required. This is a pretty good illustration of the high-tech gear these guys were going up there with. You can see the sign here that's kind of the demarcation line between Alaska and Canada. But you look at what these guys are wearing, it's you're talking about layers of thick wool clothing. It's pretty hard going. And then if you look at this character over on the far right, as far as carrying the gear, you're essentially just strapping crates to your back. So not very comfortable. Any of you have done any backpacking, that's not a real comfortable thing for an extended period of time. Well, once they got over Chilkoot Pass, with a few more miles to essentially the headwaters of the Yukon River, and this was Lake Bennett or Lake Lindeman. And most of the stampeders got up there while those two lakes were frozen. And so they had to wait until the lakes thawed so they could then go downriver. That, though, gave them time to build, makeshift boats or rafts to carry them and all their gear to Dawson City, to the gold fields. And there were a number of rapids along the way. There was quite a few drownings. In fact, eventually the Canadian Mounted Police prohibited women, because after a while women went up there as well. They prohibited women from going down the rapids. They had to get out and essentially walk around any of those places. And just like in the California gold rush, it really, the little towns just exploded. Dawson City, prior to gold being discovered, was really just kind of an outpost. It was like a village with 500 people. 2 years later, it's got 17,000 people there. And as you can imagine, it's dirty, it's unsanitary. You've got epidemics breaking out, you've got fires, and absolutely sky-high prices on any material goods that have to be brought in. My favorite is this nails, pretty handy if you're going to build anything. Nails went for, in today's price, $800 a pound. That's a lot for nails. That's more than you're going to get it's more than at Home Depot. Okay. Well, a couple years later, there's a second wave. And actually, Stephen mentioned this in the introduction he wrote up in a newsletter. There was a second discovery of gold. And this was in September 1898 on a little creek called Anvil Creek in the Nome area. And if you look at our map here, Nome is right up here. It's only 100 miles from the Arctic Circle. So in the winter, it can get to like 50 below. They discovered gold there, and it launched a whole second wave of stampeders. Frustrated miners who didn't have any success in Dawson City made their way there. The other thing, if you look at the map, and it doesn't show the steamships going there, but there's two huge advantages. One is you could take a steamship right to the shores of Nome. It was right on the coast. So you could get there without all the overland problem. The other issue is it's in Alaska. You don't have Canadian Mounted Police telling you how much gear you've got to bring in. You could just go there with hardly any gear. So it created essentially a second gold rush. One of the problems that was initially discovered is that Anvil Creek area wasn't geographically very big. It wasn't nearly as big as the Dawson City gold area. And so you had a lot of people getting there in a hurry, and everything was staked out, and they really didn't have anything to do. And so they camped out on the beach. And then they discovered something. There was gold in the sand. There was about a 30-mile stretch in front of Nome where there was gold in the ocean sand. And by the late year 1900, over 20,000 prospectors were camped out on the shores of Nome. aside from it being easy to get to and no requirement for how much gear you had to have, the laws didn't allow you to stake a claim on the beach. So it's totally open territory. And that's why you had this incredible influx of prospectors. I'm going to ask for about a few minutes of indulgence here, because my great grandparents lived in Seattle when the gold was discovered. And like so many others in Seattle, in 1897, when they heard there was gold discovered, they dropped everything and rushed up to the Dawson City area. Now, they had two kids. My grandfather was 9 years old at the time, and they kind of shuffled them off with some friends, and off they went. And we don't know if they were successful or not in the first go around in 1897. Although the family lore is that Emma was the first non-native or first white woman over the Chilkoot Pass. And like most family lore, there's no way to prove or disprove that. But they did go up in the early 1900s to Nome several times and had success. And they brought a camera with them this time. You can see in that picture that's the front street of Nome about 5 years after the gold was discovered up there on the 4th of July. So it's been built up a bit. This is a picture, I guess, of their first camp. And as you can see, a lot of the houses were sod houses, like in the Midwest. A lot of insulation, and they didn't obviously need any of those $800 a pound nails to make a sod house for the most part. And just like in California, the minute when gold was discovered in an area, it was immediately scaled up. So you go from panning for gold to bring in water cannons and long sluice boxes to scale up the gold operation. And this is a picture of I didn't do the labeling. Picture of my great grandfather leaving Nome in about 1905. I'm assuming that these small boats would ferry passengers out to the steamships, and the passengers would stand up here in the front to be transferred to the steamships. And going through a bunch of scrapbooks for this, I found two receipts, and these are gold receipts, and I don't know if there were more. You can see here, this is from Turning in Gold in Seattle. So Alfred Pritchard, November 1st, 1905, and he was turning in 124 ounces of gold dust for the exorbitant price of $18.60 an ounce. Now, obviously, that much gold today would be worth over 300,000. But again, I don't know how many more of those there were, or if those were the only two receipts. The other family lore is that as adept as Alfred and Emma were at finding gold, Alfred was equally adept at spending the money. So he didn't invest it in Ford Motor Stock or anything like that. Okay. Well, a couple of years ago, the Canadian government issued commemorative 1 ounce gold bullion coins for recognizing the 125th anniversary of what they called the last great gold rush. Actually, South Africa might have something to say about that, because they had their gold discovery started right about that same time. But the gold coins, they picture different phases of the mining for gold or the refining, and they were marketed as being 5 nines, 99.999% pure gold. Okay, let's talk about the exposition, finally. So the idea of having an exposition to commemorate the gold rush really started in 1905. The Seattle City Fathers, the media and whatnot thought this would be a great idea. And they expanded it to hopefully include the entire Pacific Rim. So it'd be much bigger than just a small exposition for the gold rush. And they were planning to have it in 1907, since the big gold announcement was in 1897. But there was a problem. There was already a large exposition planned in 1907, and that was Virginia was going to have the Jamestown Tercentennial. So that didn't work. So what about 1908? No, that didn't work either. That was a presidential election year. So they deferred until 1909. And it ran from June 1st to the middle of October. It was sited on 250 acres that were actually owned by the University of Washington. It wasn't an area big enough in Seattle to accommodate this, but the University of Washington had this unused real estate. Over 3.5 million people passed through during those 3.5 months, and then the cost was about $10 million from a wide variety of sources. They constructed about 80 buildings on that 250 acres. A lot of states had buildings. There was a government building and the manufacturer building, some trade associations. Some of the counties in Washington state had their own buildings. Um, One of the side notes, and this makes for a really bad pun, this was the first dry World's Fair. It's a bad pun because it rains all the time in Seattle. Anyway, it was dry because it was on University of Washington property, which legally didn't permit alcohol being, you know, served or sold. So again, it was happened to be the first dry World's Fair. Before we get to Mr. Hyder's so-called dollars, the exposition created a medal to recognize the best exhibits and booths and whatnot. Because although there were over 80 buildings, there were over 800 exhibits, booths, demonstrations. So these medals were created in gold-plated, silver, bronze to commemorate the best exhibits. Of course, if you do the math, it looks like everybody got an award. So it wasn't totally very exclusive. But on the obverse, the woman is representing the city of Seattle. She's holding a kind of a picture of George Washington under her left arm. She has one foot placed on a cornucopia, and there's a miner and a logger for her left, obviously representing the resources of the Northwest. And then down below, there's a Native American in a canoe. I didn't blow it up, but at the tip of the canoe, it's got the engraver's name, F. Ziegler. And these are, you find these on eBay. They're not highly valued. Well, as I had mentioned, the exposition was a huge deal for the Northwest. And on the first day, over 91,000 people passed through the turnstiles. And it was actually launched. President Taft, back in Washington, D.C., he pressed a telegraph key. And moments later, when that message was received in Seattle, that officially opened the exposition. Now, the logo of the exposition, which was on the e-newsletter we all got, this was designed by a local woman named Adelaide Hanscom, and it was incorporated, as you'll see, on all the official souvenir so-called dollars. And the logo, the three women represent the three areas of the world. The woman in purple is Japanese. She's holding a freighter ship. The woman in white representing Alaska or the Yukon is holding gold. And the woman in green representing the Pacific slope or the Pacific states, holding a locomotive. The colorful rays of light over their heads, as you would imagine, represent the northern lights. And how these are portrayed in a number of different ways create some of the varieties that Mr. Hyder had a hand in designating. This is the official medal, souvenir medal, or so-called dollar. And there's 13 different varieties of the obverse. And this was adapted from the logo by George T. Morgan. You can see the three women on the obverse. And in this variety, we've got William Seward, who was honored throughout the exposition for, in hindsight, having the wisdom to really drive that purchase of Alaska. And over the center woman's head, you've got the northern lights, how they're portrayed on this particular variety. On the reverse, we have this the seal of the city of Seattle. And this is the man there's representing Chief Sealyl, who Seattle was named after. And these were made, these various official souvenir medals were made in gold-plated brass, silver-plated brass, copper, and bronze. And I apologize, some of these images are a little fuzzy, but this just shows you some of the various ways that those northern lights are portrayed on the different varieties. You've got kind of the asymmetrical here on the left, which is most like the logo, an asymmetrical portrayal, and then asymmetrical with 7, 8, or 9 rays. And then even this one down in the center, where you have kind of pointed rays. And on the reverse of these, if they didn't have the city of Seattle, they had either the government building or the manufacturers building. And there's 6 different varieties with the government building and 2 varieties with the manufacturers building. And this is what one of them looks like. Um, on the reverse here, this is the manufacturer's building, and these are, obviously replications of the actual buildings constructed for the exposition. And when I was doing research on this, I have to say these buildings they constructed were pretty big. This is a picture of the manufacturer's building, which we just saw on the reverse of the so-called dollar, under construction. These are big structures. Well, one of the highlights of the exposition was on September 30th when President Taft actually visited. And there was the usual, the perfunctory speeches and the VIPs attending. One of the things that Taft did that was very popular, he went to the Alaska building and panned for gold, which you could do. And that was a big hit with the crowds and whatnot. To commemorate Taft's visit, and this is considered probably the most artistic of I think 23 varieties of so-called dollars made, is this piece that commemorates Taft's visit. And the obverse portrays those 3 women a little differently. You've got the Pacific coast on the left, Alaska holding gold nuggets and standing, and then the woman representing Japan is actually on the right. And on the reverse, it says to commemorate William Taft's visit. And I didn't blow this up, and I apologize. Down here at about 7 o'clock on the reverse, it says the Mayer brothers. The Mayer brothers were the group that was marketing and selling almost all these so-called dollars, even the ones produced by the mint on site, which I'll show you in a second. So they appear on a lot of these so-called dollars that we'll see. Well, I mentioned the government building, and probably for those of us on this meeting, this probably would have been our favorite building because of what they had inside. The post office had a complete stamp collection. The U.S. Treasury Department had a display of banknotes and bonds. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing had a printing demonstration. They even had an assay office. You could bring in raw gold and have it assayed and refined right there while you were waiting. And of course, the Philadelphia Mint had a large portion of the building, and they were minting the so-called dollars right there on site. So you could get it literally hot off the press. And this is another version that has the city of Seattle on the obverse, and that the U.S. government building on the reverse. And there's a couple varieties within the U.S. government portrayal, the building portrayal, where there's a different number of flags. So again, a lot of permutations in this. So another quick diversion. Within the exposition, the most popular thing was kind of the sideshow area where you had rides, food, and kind of sideshow type stuff. And they called this area the pay streak. For those of just as a reminder, the pay streak is the vein of gold or silver that runs through rock. And this was termed the pay streak. And the most popular part of the pay streak was the most controversial. In fact, had Seattle area, some of the religious groups and the kind of the moralists up in arms. and it was an exhibit called The Streets of Cairo. And in the streets of Cairo, they had a woman named Princess Lola, who was scantily clad, performing, quote, the death dance of Cleopatra, unquote. Um, anyway, it was very controversial. I really tried to find you guys a picture of Princess Lola, but I was unsuccessful. But I just thought that was an amusing sidelight. So as I mentioned, William Seward did get kind of his just recognition with the exposition. This was a stamp the U.S. Postal Service issued commemorating both Seward and the exposition on June 1st, the day the exposition opened. Now, one of the more popular attractions, educational attractions, if you will, was in the Alaska building. And the Alaska building had a display with 70 gold bars or bricks and a bunch of nuggets. In today's gold pricing, worth about $300 million. So, people love this kind of stuff. This was a big attraction. What I think was kind of interesting about this is the security features around it. Obviously, it was encased in thick bulletproof glass. You had guards. But just like, I don't know if any of you have seen the movie National Treasure, where there's a map on the Declaration, but they lower the Declaration down to the basement. Well, just like that, after hours at night when the exposition was closed, this whole display would descend into a subterranean vault, which I don't know, for 1909, I thought that was pretty slick. Now I know what you're all asking, since you're all so many of you are in California. What did the great state of California bring to show off the magnificence of this incredible state? And I'm glad you asked. California brought an elephant made of walnuts. Yes. And there's more. They also brought a bear made of raisins. And I don't know what medal these wonderful awards received, but I've no doubt these artistic treasures are currently housed in the Louvre next to the Mona Lisa, so they can be admired by the populace. The state of Utah also had a building and created a so-called dollar. On the obverse, it says Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition, 1909, Utah exhibit. And then the reverse says the Great Seal of the State of Utah, 1896, Virgin Utah Copper Industry. Now, I have to confess, this is the only so-called dollar tied to the exposition that I actually personally own. It's a little embarrassing, but it also is one that tones very, very nicely. One of the other so-called dollars that was created, and this is called the gold panner edition for obvious reasons. There's a gold panner on it. In the upper left, we have a portrayal of Chief SeaYle. And on the right, we have William Seward. And under William Seward, it says Father of Alaska. And this particular version was available in antique silver, as you see, and gold-plated brass. And on the reverse, down here, if you can see the cursor, it says the Progressive Mayors. Not mayors as in cities, but the Mayor brothers. Again, they're the ones selling and promoting these. So this is another one of the medals or so-called dollars that was made, obviously honoring William Seward prominently. On the reverse of this, it actually has a couple signatures. One of them, Chilberg, for example, he was president of the committee that came up with the idea for the exposition, that planned it, that organized it. So certainly getting his recognition that's due. And again, down here towards the bottom on the reverse, it says the Mayer brothers, Seattle, Washington. Again, they were the group selling and marketing all these so-called dollars. And then the last so-called dollar, I think is the most intriguing. For a number of reasons. It was called the official gold coin of the exposition. And these were issued in 1 pennyweight, half pennyweight, and quarter pennyweight. in 10-karat gold. And just as a reminder, a pennyweight is 1/18 of an ounce of gold. Well, what makes these interesting is, of course, they weren't made in 1909 and sold at the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition. They were made in 1915 in San Francisco for the Pan-Pacific Exposition. But it's the two people involved in this coin that really give it interesting provenance. The first is that it was designed by Jules Charbonneau, who established Ye Olde Curiosity Shop in Seattle in 1899. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Ye Olde Curiosity Shop, it's an icon on the Seattle waterfront, and it has been since it was established. And it's basically, think of a sideshow under one roof. A lot of weird stuff, a lot of curiosities that Charbonneau accumulated. So, for example, there's a mummified man who they found in the Arizona desert. There's large formaldehyde jugs filled with formed animals, like a two-headed calf or a piglet with 12 legs, just weird stuff. Now, having grown up in Seattle as a kid, that was a fun place to go. But the other person involved with this coin was none other than Farron Zerbe. He was the one who marketed and really promoted the sale of these coins. And I think, as you all know, Farron Zerbe, kind of infamous numismatist who, rightly or wrongly, has kind of had his reputation revisited by the ANA. Doug Ward could give us an impromptu hour-long presentation on that. But so those two characters, Charbonneau and Zerbe, kind of the quintessential promoters and marketers were behind this coin, which I think gives it some great provenance. Well, just to kind of step back and wrap up quickly, every town, every city that brings either an Olympics or a World's Fair is hoping it'll have some long-term impact beyond that initial surge in tourism. And looking back at the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition, it really didn't do that. There wasn't a big jump in immigration afterwards. There wasn't a subsequent jump in real estate prices that a lot of speculators had hoped for. It didn't even boost Pacific Rim trade, because the only countries outside of the US that attended this were Canada and Japan. And I'm not sure it changed kind of the backwater perception of Seattle. Anecdotally, when I went down to college in Los Angeles, I think at the time everybody thought that everybody in Seattle was a lumberjack, and why wasn't I wearing a flannel shirt? I think they thought it was like it was portrayed in that TV show, Here Come the Brides. But one thing it did do was it dramatically expanded the University of Washington, because a handful of those buildings were retained and incorporated into the university, and really brought it from a little small town college to really getting on the pathway to being a major university. So from that standpoint, it was a big success. And before I take any questions, for your entertainment, in 1976, my father and I and my uncle and my cousin retraced our great-grandparents' footsteps over the Chilkoot Pass and along that trail. And this is me at the ripe old age of 22. Haven't changed a bit. I haven't lost any hair or anything. But anyway, with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. And if I can't, I'm sure Mr. Hyder can jump in and do so.
Well, let me correct a couple of misstatements.
Okay, thank you.
The Old Curiosity Shop was actually owned by Stanley, Papa Stanley, and Charbonneau was in the Navy, and it was time to re-up, and they went into port in Seattle, and on his shore leave, he went into Ye Olde Curiosity Shop, met Stanley's daughter. They got married a week later, and for a while he did run Ye Olde Curiosity Shop. And I actually interviewed Stanley's grandson, and his son now runs the shop. But I went up there, and he remembers Zerbe, and they have a piece of Swedish plate money that they got from Zerbe. So Zerbe's very much involved in that. but Charbonneau's the one who designed the 1909 gold piece, and it was sold in 1909, and then later the leftovers were sold in 1915, and so it was sold. It was billed by Charbonneau and Stanley as the official gold piece of the exposition, and Zerbe wrote an article comparing it to his gold pieces and said he never declared them to be official gold, which he actually did, unlike Charbonneau. So they knew each other and were involved in all of that.
I should have talked to you before this. Thank you. I appreciate
But you
it.
had, I mean, the stuff about the Alaska gold rush and so forth was great. Your everything else about your review of the exposition was great. It was a very good talk.
Yes. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Jeff. That was a great presentation. And now that I've learned yet more about it.
If I could ask a question of Jeff, if the University of Washington took over the buildings, that means the buildings were made of permanent structures, unlike some of the buildings that were produced for the Panama Pacific. Is that correct?
They only kept, it was either 8 or 9 of the larger buildings, and they since have torn them down and whatnot. But you're right, because most of those world fairs or exposition, it's like plaster of Paris over a facade. It's made to be torn down, but a number of them were, more permanent structures.
Thanks, Jeff. That was a good presentation. Appreciated it. So is the Yule Curiosity Shop still open today?
Yep.
Is it
Yeah.
is it similar to how it had been over the years, or?
I haven't been in it lately. I know they still have Sylvester. That's the name of the mummified man they found. It's probably more now souvenir type stuff. Some of the stuff they had now probably isn't considered politically correct. I mean, they had a lot of freaky baby animals in these formaldehyde jugs that
It's not like
I'm not sure.
It's not like
What?
Spencer's in the mall now, is it?
So when I was there, the back wall is filled with all that old stuff. There is the male mummy. There's also a female mummy. And then hanging from the ceiling throughout are such things as the mermaid and the baby mermaid and a number of oddities like that. So a lot of it is still there, but there's also a lot of the modern tourist kitsch.
Yeah.
I also wanted to know if you've ever heard of a poet called or named Robert Service, Robert W. Service.
I've heard of him. Don't ask me to quote him or anything.
Yeah, I experienced. He was like in his 20s and 30s, I think, when the gold rush was going on up in the Yukon, and so he was one of the people who tried his luck. But he was also a poet, and he wrote a lot of really, really great poems. He's one of my favorites. This is his book. I don't know if you can see it in my.
Did he write ones like The Cremation of Sam McGee?
The cremation, that's my favorite. Cremation of Sam McGee, The Shooting of Dan McGrew. Yeah, all of those.
No,
really great stuff.
The person who took that picture of us in 1976 has done a lot of climbing, and I've climbed a lot with him. He had memorized that poem, and he was doing it over and over along the trail. Got to where we hated it, but yeah.
You should have switched to the Shooting of Dan McGrew. Yeah, he's one of my favorites. Really good stuff.
So
Jeff, I have a question. Go ahead, Bill.
Well, so my question is, if you had to take 2,000 pounds and you hauled 100 pounds at a time up to the top of that cliff, was there a place to store your goods until you got to 2,000 pounds?
I would assume so. I don't know, but I would certainly assume so. Not a lot of pictures from, that. I mean, I don't think a lot of people brought cameras. Anyway, I don't know.
Yeah, I wondered the same thing, and because you'd think otherwise, if you just put it up there, that it would be stolen by someone else.
I would imagine nobody went up there alone. I think you'd have a partner or partners who would be, watching out for you. Plus, that guy wouldn't have to keep going back and forth. He was standing up there guarding the stuff, so that'd be a good job.
Unless you trade off.
The Canadian Mounties had a very large outpost at the top of the Chilkoot when you got to the Canadian border, because you had to show the 2,000 pounds before they'd let you cross the border into Canada. You had
Yeah,
to
and
add 2,000.
they did have scales to weigh stuff.
Hey, Jeff, this is Mike. Thanks again. That was a very interesting.
Interesting presentation and beautifully put together too. Gosh, the visuals are really nice. Do you have any idea why the purchase of Alaska became the animating force of Seward's life for so long? I mean, how did he hook his wagon to that?
The stuff
Pause.
I read,
Mhm.
some of you may know more. He didn't get really intimately involved in it until the Andrew Johnson administration. The Steckel was involved for the whole 10-year period, but from what I read, and it wasn't super extensive, Seward didn't get involved that early, but he really saw it as a way to create a legacy for himself.
Okay.
Even though at the time, there was no gold, there was no petroleum, it wasn't considered strategic. It was just like the Louisiana Purchase. It was a lot of land.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the nationality of the Russian envoy? That's not a Russian surname.
No, that guy was French, and
Was a Frenchman?
he spoke French, which the Tsar did as well. So
Thank you.
Yeah.
You mentioned there weren't many cameras taken up there. I can imagine there weren't. And not a lot of people had probably seen the Northern Lights. It kind of struck me that all the depictions on the coins and the medals were not very characteristic of the Northern Lights.
no, that'd be tough to portray accurately, though, if you think about it. That's
Yeah.
they're kind of fog-like.
But they occurred in waves, and there's nothing similar to that. It kind of makes you wonder if anybody depicting them had actually seen them.
Yeah, it's really impossible to portray the Northern Lights on a coin or metal.
The
Yeah.
official seal for the logo for the AYPE actually was colored, and they had the one example that you showed where the rays are diagonal, many other rays. But in those rays itself, they had a chromatic colors scheme on it. So they definitely were portraying the Northern Lights. So you got to see it in color to see it.
And you got to remember that back then we didn't have the kind of light pollution as today. So if you go back greater in time, the Northern Lights were observed as far down as in Central America on occasions. And just recently, we've had the Northern Lights being visible down here. I've seen them once in the hills behind Santa Barbara and once on the California-Oregon border. They were not color. They were just streaks of light in the sky, because nowadays there's so much light pollution that does not come through.
Mm.
But in those days, people were probably much more familiar with the Northern Lights than today.
Bill, I was going to ask you if you had a good time when you went to the exposition.
I went to Seattle Exposition. I did not go to, I missed it by a year.
He went to the other one in Seattle.
Well, thank you all very much. I'll